Welcome to Agent Noob everyone. Let's talk about one of the more significant changes to the meta, which is the heavy Mangonel nerf. The latest patch was a massive nerf to these boulder hurling beasts, and we can begin to hear echoes of whether or not this was too big of a nerf for them. Well, let's look at the before and after, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Alright, let's revisit how the old Mangonels dished out their damage before they were nerfed. Here's a quick snippet from my previous video explaining this as a quick refresher. Units are damaged by either 12, 24, or 36 damage. There is no in between. Yes, it's determined by how far away you are from the impact zone, but enemy units will receive the damage in thirds, either partially, fully, or none if they're able to dodge it. Number 2. The Mangonel's shot isn't entirely accurate and doesn't deal the same damage throughout. Here's a better, exaggerated example. We can clearly see roughly 1.5 tiles of guaranteed damage. The inaccuracies come into play around the second tile, as you can see some mana-times barely surviving. The third tile is a mixed bag of either one boulder damage of 12 or sometimes two boulders worth of damage of 24, and this stems from the inaccurate shots. But you don't necessarily have to remember all these details to be honest. The summary of all of this is that you could expect an average of roughly 30 damage within the 2-tile radius and 15 damage on the 3rd-tile radius for each shot. Of course, this is a crap ton of damage per hit, as you can realistically deal a few hundred damage or more if the enemy units aren't in staggered formation. Now, that video was of course using the old radius, but that has since changed. The surface side patch reduced the AoE radius for the Mangonels from 1.25 to 0.75 tiles. There's a ton of nuance in the 0.5 tile nerf, so let's begin with the mathematics first. As corrected by some of you in my previous video, this is not a simple practical 40% reduction in AoE, as it is a 40% reduction to the radius only. The actual area is of course pi r squared. Hence, the old AoE used to be pi times 1.25 to the power of 2, which was roughly 4.91. When we plug in the new 0.7 tile radius to calculate pi times 0.75 to the power of 2, we get roughly 1.77. That is a whopping 64% nerf to the overall impact area of each of the Mangonel's boulders. This theoretically means that each Mangonel shot will hit 64% fewer enemy units on average, which in turn means 64% less damage, right? Well, not quite, as there's a lot more practical nuance than that. Okay, let's look at things from a practical sense in the game's engine. As we know, Mangonels shoot 3 boulders, and each of them have an individual impact zone. That's exactly how the 36, 24, or 12 damage comes to play. We also know that there's a slight variance in the shots, as boulders sometimes go slightly further away from each other and land in different spots. The closer the enemy unit is to the impact zone, the more likely they are to be hit by all 3 boulders and take all of the 36 damage. For reference, here's a side-by-side of the old impact zone with the new one, and keep in mind that this is a rough average of all 3 boulders. First of all, we can immediately see how much smaller the impact zone is. Don't let the slight variance in the angle fool you, as it's the same 9 rows of mana charms that I used in both tests. We can clearly see that the old Mangonel could easily damage 10 rows of mana charms, while the new one can only hit 7 rows. That said, this test includes stray shots over multiple shots though. Hence, if we move away from the numbers for a moment and look at the average Mangonel shot like I also did in my older Mangonel video, I concluded that a Mangonel shot over a tightly packed enemy army deals roughly 30 damage around just about 2 tiles, and roughly 15 damage on the 3rd tile. Now, based on what we see, it seems like the guaranteed roughly 30 damage is limited to about just 1 tile now, down from the previous 2 tiles. And the 15-ish damage is limited to around the 2 tile mark instead of the 3 tiles, right? Well, when I actually looked at the numbers, that wasn't the case, as it gets even worse for the Mangonels. Theoretically speaking, what I just said about the change in tiles is correct, but only for the average 3 boulder impact zone. Hence, you can indeed expect the bulk of your damage to be within 1 tile, and some spread damage of 12 or perhaps even 24 within the 2nd tile. However, since the impact radius is calculated individually per boulder, this means that the area in which all 3 boulders overlap is much smaller now. Hence, practically speaking, even though we can observe that enemy units now take damage in a much smaller area than before, and that looks bad enough already, what we don't immediately see is the reduction of the full 36 damage to units, as fewer units now receive the full damage. The rest of the mana charms receive 24 damage from 2 boulders, or in some cases, even 12 from just 1. Unfortunately, I don't have the older version of the game to test the average change and see how much of a difference there is now, but there's also simply too many moving parts here regarding how packed the enemy units are and what type of RNG you're going to get with each boulder shot. In other words, it's difficult to exactly gauge how much less damage each Mangonel shot does now. We can, however, observe 2 things very clearly, as we don't have to be fully exact to come up with these 2 practical conclusions. Depending on your RNG, the impact zone is at least more than 50% smaller now than it used to be, and the halved impact zone itself also does roughly 1/3 less damage than it used to, as I'll assume that it's now very likely that one of the boulders won't overlap with others. So units previously hit with 3 boulders will be hit by 2, those hit with 2 will be hit by 1, and those hit by 1 won't be hit at all anymore. In other words, this seemingly simple 0.5 tile radius change is arguably the biggest nerf to a single unit to date by the developers. I'm not sure if they intended the trickle effect of the nerf, but we'll see if they adjust the Mangonel mechanics in the future. As to my opinion on whether or not the Mangonels are too weak now, I think they are. If you watched my previous video, I mentioned that the Mangonels, at least from a singular unit perspective, were fine. They had clear counters, but they also did good damage in certain scenarios. It definitely was a part of the siege meta that most people didn't like, but them being classified as overpowered was a stretch. Now, however, I think that we can all agree they're just too weak. You can arguably even micro your archers into Mangonels now, which are supposed to be countered by them. Their cost is simply too high for how little damage they do. They can still play a niche role behind walls defensively, but overall, I think the devs need to figure out a way to readjust them so we don't return to the siege meta again, but also not make them useless in most scenarios. Well, that's all you need to know about how the new patch butchered the mighty Mangonels. Hope you all enjoyed this short and sweet video on game mechanics, and if you'd like to see more of this type of content, please be sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. And thank you once again for those of you who support me on Patreon. The link is below for those of you who'd like to join them. As always, thanks for watching everyone, don't be afraid of the Mangonels in the current patch anymore, and see you all in the next one.